The Addiction Podcast, Point of No Return.
Hello, I'm Joni Siegel, the host of the Addiction Podcast. In 2022, over 100,000 people died from drug and alcohol abuse, and that number is growing daily. Fentanyl poisoning, pot, cocaine, heroin, and even psychedelics and alcohol all contribute to this crisis, while we're bombarded with promotions from thousands of rehabs. Newborns are born addicted, and the majority of homeless people struggle with drug addiction. Drug dealers exploit online resources to sell to teens, and antidepressant use is spiraling out of control. This podcast features brutally honest guest interviews revealing harsh realities and offering hope and solutions through their stories. We don't sugarcoat anything. Guests speak raw and real. More importantly, you'll find inspiration to understand, overcome, and achieve recovery, whether for yourself or to help others, some within your own family, many among your friends or associates. Whether you're seeking help or just a glimmer of hope, our podcast equips you with the latest insights to confront this generational battle. Many listeners tell us they want to join the fight, but do not have the time or money to act, lobby, or just help. If that's you, go to www.patreon.com/theaddictionpodcast and see how you can help. So, Philip Eil, investigative journalist, you researched about addiction and a doctor involved in it from some degree. What was the most shocking thing you found in your research that you maybe didn't know before?
Well, there's a story that I tell in the book of this doctor who I wrote about, Paul Volkman, who was a med school classmate of my dad, who's now serving 4 life terms in prison for prescription drug dealing. At one point during his criminal activity, which was down in southern Ohio, he had gone so far off the rails that he was practicing out of a house, an unmarked house in a residential neighborhood, and word had gotten around both to people who wanted the medications he was prescribing, but also to the family members of some of these patients, many of whom were desperate to see their family members stay on their track of recovery. And there was one story of a desperate family member barging into the clinic, demanding to see the doctor. He was seeing a patient at the time, and she told this story on the stand during his trial of basically warning him, my son is a recovering addict, and I've heard he's been going to you, and I'm worried about his life. And if you don't stop prescribing to him, she said, basically, I have a gun in my car, and threatened him.
Is drug addiction tearing your family apart? Don't let it consume another moment of your life. Take action now with addicted.org. Their experienced team is solely dedicated to helping families and individuals affected by drug addiction across the United States find the right rehab center quickly and tailored to specific individual needs. When you dial 1-877-919-8126, you're connecting with a dedicated rehab specialist who knows the ins and outs of addiction recovery and cares about you. Don't hesitate. Don't wait for another day to slip away. Call us now at 1-877-919-8126 or visit addicted.org. Let their family help yours on your journey to recovery.
And it was an astonishing story in the courtroom, and it paints a picture of the kind of environment this guy was working in.
Wow. So, Philip, you said your dad's a doctor, right?
Yes.
And your dad went to medical school with this other fellow?
Yeah, they actually went to both college and medical school. First, undergrads at the University of Rochester from 1964 to 1968, and then they were classmates together in an MD PhD program at the University of Chicago from 1968 to 1974.
Okay, and how and when did you hear about what was going on and decide to focus on it in your book?
So I didn't know who Paul Volckmann was. You know, my dad has stayed in touch with some friends from that time of his life, but Paul was not one of them. This was not a guy who hung out at our house or came over for dinner or even went to, family events. The first time I learned about him was when I was 23 years old. I was just starting out in my career in journalism, and my dad, who had recently heard from Paul after being out of touch with him for many years, meant he and my mom were talking about uh, Paul's legal situation. And at the time, Paul hadn't gone to trial, but he was charged by the federal government with this massive prescription drug dealing scheme that took place over almost 3 years in Southern Ohio, in a part of the country and in a part of Ohio that's been really hard hit by opiates and addiction. It's been called Ground Zero. Sam Quinones in his book Dreamland talks about it. And prosecutors alleged not only was Volkman kind of flooding this area with opiates and other controlled substances, but that a number of patients had died as a result of this activity. And so my dad, who is a mild-mannered, nerdy guy, soft-spoken, is not the kind of guy who I was used to knowing people who were charged with horrifying crimes like this. And as a young journalist who was eager and ambitious and who had recently read In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, I was immediately fascinated by the story of what on earth had happened to this guy who went to med school with my dad.
And did you actually interview him? I haven't read your book, I apologize, but did
No,
you
that's
actually
okay.
talk to him?
I did, yes.
What did he
So,
say? What was his rationale?
so a few months after learning about Volkmann's indictment, I was already about to enter a graduate writing program. And so I had a lot of time on my hands to focus on a project like this. And I basically had the space to pursue this. I wrote Volkmann a letter. He was awaiting trial, living in Chicago, which was where he lived for most of his adult life. In the book, I talk about how I explained who I was, my connection to him, that my dad had gone to med school with him, and that I was interested in learning what he had to say about all this. And he called me up a couple weeks after getting the letter and agreed to speak with me. He placed a condition that I needed to suspend everything I believed to be true about the US government, and I said, sure. And I drove out there in December of 2009 for the first in a series of in-person interviews that spanned, I mean, overall, I spoke with this guy and recorded our conversations for over 15 hours. And then I continued to correspond with him after his conviction. Now, to get to your question, at a very basic level, Paul Volckmann still maintains he's innocent, that he was a legitimate, conscientious, law-abiding doctor who was doing his best in the interest of his patients. And he's a very bright guy who has an answer for basically every question about what on earth he was doing in these cash-only pain clinics that weren't affiliated with local hospitals, that were patrolled by armed guards, that were prescribing enormous amounts of opiates. Um, and so I listened to his story, but what I do in the book is I thoroughly fact check that story and I cross-reference it with over 100 other interviews and the lengthy transcript from Volkmann's 8-week criminal trial. And what I found is that he's a deeply unreliable narrator. A lot of the things he says don't add up. They aren't true in some cases. And if you go down to this town in the area of Southern Ohio where he was working, as I have done many times, and you ask people, was this guy legit? Was he really helping patients? They say absolutely not. This was a story that they had seen many times over. This
Interesting.
part of Southern Ohio, Appalachian Ohio, right on the border of Kentucky and near West Virginia, they had seen doctors hauled off to prison for sketchy activity relating to drugs for years before Volkmann and for years after. So one of
Interesting.
the first trips I took down there, I interviewed a journalist, and he said, which one was he? We've seen this so many times.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. It's not dissimilar to the pill mills that used to be all over Florida
Mhm.
and were shut down by someone in the drug czar at the time. Yeah. So you interviewed a lot of the people who were quote unquote his patients. Sometimes. The hardest thing about getting someone into recovery is getting them to agree to treatment. Bobby Newman, a certified drug counselor with 30 years experience and an over 85% success rate as an interventionist, has created a series of 12 videos that you can use right now to learn every step to get your loved one to agree to treatment. Call 866-989-4499 today and say the word podcast to get a 10% discount. Or go to newmaninterventions.com and type in the word podcast for a 10% discount. This service comes with a free 1-hour consultation with Bobby. Many listeners tell us they want to join the fight, but do not have the time or money to act, lobby, or just help. If that's you, go to www.patreon.com/theaddictionpodcast and see how you can help.
I interviewed some of his patients. They, for understandable reasons, were somewhat difficult to track down or unwilling to talk. What I did get was the transcript of their testimony from the trial. Now,
Okay.
I did in the indictment, there were 14 deceased patients whom prosecutors said had died as a result of overdoses from pills Volkman prescribed to them. And so those patients and their lives were really a central part of the story I wanted to tell and the trial. And I did interview a number of their family members to hear what these folks whose loved ones had died so tragically and at such young ages, many of these people were in their 30s or 40s. I interviewed about 24 of these family members, and that really was a key part of my reporting. And I knew I wanted their voices in this story as much as, if not more than, I had Volkman's.
Right, because they had lost people.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
How many people was he ultimately charged with being responsible for their death?
So the jury, so the trial the crimes took place in southern Ohio, about 2 hours due south of Columbus, right on the Ohio River, and the trial took place in federal court in Cincinnati, and this was in 2011. Over about 8 weeks. It was a massive trial. The government called 70 witnesses. Volkman called 10 witnesses in his own defense. And the jury basically didn't buy much of the defense's story at all. They convicted him on drug dealing to nearly all of the patients he was accused of dealing drugs to. And for each count that had a death attached to it, they had the option of not just convicting him of dealing drugs, but of causing that patient's death. And in 4 cases, they held him directly responsible for causing a patient's death. And ultimately, that led to this extraordinary sentence of 4 consecutive life terms for Paul Volkman. And as part of my research, I looked into, there have been dozens of cases of doctors charged and convicted of prescription drug dealing during the opiate epidemic, but I haven't found any sentence that meets or matches that sentence. It's really a high watermark. 4 consecutive life terms.
Wow. Wow. What was the defense? What did the defense say?
Volkman's defense was that not only was he not guilty, but he was actually doing something admirable in that he was helping people who had been cast off by the rest of the medical system, who had intractable pain from various conditions or injuries, that had this pain hadn't been responsive to prior treatments, injections, surgeries, medication, and that he was treating people in an underserved area who really that he was giving them their lives back, that they had been debilitated by this pain, and that he was helping them get back to their lives. And it is true that a number of his patients did start out with real pain, but as we saw in not all of them, certainly there were some who were just seeking the drugs, or others who were turning around and selling the pills, which was a robust black market down there. But in a number of cases, you heard folks who started out with pain, and then over time, in the months or years that they were seeing him, their pain issues became eclipsed by issues with drug addiction. And you heard that story, and you heard it from family members as well. that their lives changed pretty dramatically in the time they were seeing this doctor.
Wow. What types of people were his defense? Were they other doctors who, or
So it was kind of
just curious?
striking that there was such a mismatch in how many witnesses were called. The government called 70 witnesses. He called just 10. And of course, the standard is lower for the defense in a criminal trial. They just had to prove beyond, add enough reasonable doubt for jurors to say, well, I have doubts here, so I need to acquit. They called what I thought was striking, just two former patients. Now, Volkman claimed to have hundreds of patients who he says, of course, he was helping and people who, were so appreciative to him. But when the rubber hit the road during his criminal trial, only two patients testified. I found that striking. Meanwhile,
Yeah.
there were about 15 or 16 former patients who testified for the prosecution
Right.
in service of the narrative that he was, in fact, a drug dealer. In addition to those two patients, there were a number of former employees who felt that, he was legitimate, nurses who had worked at his office. And what it came down to in the case, because the law that he was prosecuted under, the Controlled Substances Act, is based on this kind of subjective interpretation of what is legitimate medicine. That was really what they were arguing.
Hmm.
The prosecution said this wasn't legitimate and it was drug dealing. Volkman said it was legitimate and it was medicine. There were three expert witnesses who testified for the defense, and there were a number of experts who testified for the prosecution, arguing in either case for the illegitimacy of what was going on or for the legitimacy in the defense's case.
I got it. Boy, it would make me want to investigate those who said it was legitimate. Just saying.
Well, it was fascinating because, and here's an important point, is that
You are listening to the Addiction Podcast, Point of No Return. For more information on the podcast or to reach out if you have a story you would like to share with us, go to our Facebook page by the same name, or you can email us at theaddictionpodcast@yahoo.com or go to our website, theaddictionpodcast.com. And please remember to subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts and give us a 5-star review.
my book is not anti-pain patient.
Right.
My book is not anti-opiates,
Right.
anti-access to opiates. And what I found so interesting is, in theory at least, the idea that chronic pain patients should get treatment for their suffering is, of course, unimpeachable. Who's going to
Right.
be against treating people who are in pain? I'm certainly not. But what you saw with Volkman and with a lot of people or businesses in this era, and his crimes took place from 2003 to 2006, within about a decade of the introduction of OxyContin
Yep.
and all the things that came with that, you have a case study in a guy who, like many folks in that time period, made a profit for himself in the name of chronic pain treatment, and cut a lot of corners and I think tossed away a lot of his responsibilities along the way.
Yep.
And so, through this one story, it's a specific story of one guy and the damage he caused, but it's also, a snapshot of a historical era in our country,
Yep.
which, now we're in different phases of the opiate epidemic. We've moved on to heroin and fentanyl. And as you know from Florida, a lot of those pill mills are closed down, but
Yep.
the effects are still being felt.
Yep. Yep. Interesting. What's the name of your book and where can people get it?
The book is called Prescription for Pain: How a Once Promising Doctor Became the Pill Mill Killer.
Okay.
And people can get it wherever they buy books. It's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I'm a big fan of local independent bookstores. They can get it there. Pill Mill Killer, which I cite in the headline, or the title rather, is a nickname given to Volkman by a TV journalist in his basically adopted hometown of Chicago after his conviction came through in 2011. That was a name that this TV journalist gave him.
Interesting. Have you done any more research like into other areas of this whole pandemic or addiction, or are you moving in a different direction?
Well, for the book, I mean, I spent almost 15 years on and off on the book, and I really dove in head first to the subjects involved. Here I was I've just turned 39, but I was in my mid 20s and I didn't have an MD. I didn't have a PhD. How do you, as a journalist, go about assessing whether this highly qualified and intelligent guy's claims are true?
Right.
So, what do you do as a journalist? You pick up the phone and you call experts.
Yep.
And so I wound up interviewing a lot of experts, interviews, many of which didn't make it into the book, but were just for my own, edification and feeling prepared. So I spoke with experts on pain and addiction from various higher ed institutions, and I kept having these conversations because in a lot of subjects, when you interview experts, you start to hear similar things over two or three conversations. But when it came to chronic pain, and the proper treatment of it with opiates, what I found was there was a lot of disagreement within the field. There was a lot of emotionally charged feelings. I had people tell me that this is a subject that inspires intense emotional reactions almost on the level of gun control or reproductive rights.
Right.
Now, I think maybe some of that disagreement has settled down slightly because the opiate epidemic has been so devastating and overwhelming. But still, there is a tug of war between the forces I described of preventing addiction and overdose on one hand and adequately treating pain on another. And it took me a long, long time to feel equipped as a journalist to get in there and tell a story like that.
Interesting. You told one story about the woman. Do you have any other stories you can share with us?
Well,
Maybe ones that impacted you the most when you talked to people affected by this man.
so a big part of my job for this book was getting his side of the story, right? And I got that in the in-person interviews and in years of correspondence. And that was an important part of the story. But when it came to these family members of loved ones who had died tragically too soon, leaving behind kids, siblings, spouses, parents, that was really a heavy responsibility as a journalist that I took very seriously. And it was yet another reason why I didn't want to rush this. Because here I was trying to tell the stories of people who were no longer around to speak for themselves. People who, if I was just going by the trial transcript, the trial transcript didn't really talk about who they were as full people at all. They were discussed in terms of, understandably for the purposes of the trial, in terms of, what their blood levels were when they died, or what their autopsy revealed, or what the scene of their death showed. And that was important, but I didn't just want that to be what I included in the book, because of course that was not just what these people were. So to answer your question, when I approached this part of the reporting of speaking to deceased patients' family members pretty late in the process after I had gotten my book deal, and I was slow to do it at first because here I was, a stranger, basically approaching people via Facebook and asking them about one of the worst moments of their lives,
Right.
which is a thing I don't do lightly. And I wound up getting kind of a pep talk from a fellow reporter who said, it may cause distress, but also these people, many of them may really welcome the opportunity to speak about their loved one.
Yep.
And I found often that that was the case. And those conversations were very difficult, of course, but they were remarkably gratifying. I think not just to me, but in many cases to the folks who were telling the stories. I think it's really powerful when somebody shows up, as I did, and just wants to listen about this person who they're probably thinking about day in and day out,
Yep.
And it, I have heard from some of those folks that what I wrote, that they appreciated what I wrote, and that is, I've said elsewhere, I really don't care what critics of the book and the press say. The audience I cared about the most were the family members
Yep.
of the folks I wrote about.
Yep. Did you hear from Volkman after you wrote your book, after it was published? Just curious.
No, it's a good question. So we spoke for about more than a decade. And then in the course of my reporting on the book, I wrote a magazine article in 2017 for Cincinnati Magazine. And it was given the headline, "The Pill Mill That Ravaged Portsmouth." And Paul is a very angry, very egotistical guy. And he did not like, to put it mildly, the way that he was described in this article, even though I certainly gave him his fair share of airtime.
Yeah, but
And
he doesn't
said,
think he's wrong.
of course.
Yeah.
So he got very angry at me, sent me a letter, called me a bunch of names, and stopped talking to me for a few years. And then we reconnected briefly after I got the book deal in 2021. But again, at one point, he asked me to do research for him from prison to help him, on one of his attempts to get out of prison. And I said, no, that's not what I'm here to do. I'm a journalist. And that was unacceptable to him. So we stopped talking again then. And that was the last I heard of him. In late 2023, when I knew what the title of the book was going to be and when it was coming out, I sent him a letter informing him of those things. And I didn't hear back. And after the book came out earlier in the spring, I sent him another letter again, telling him what the book was, that it was coming out, offering to send him a copy if he wanted. Didn't hear back.
Okay.
So,
And you didn't have to do that. That was more courtesy. I mean,
I felt it was important to. I'm
Yeah.
not surprised I didn't hear back from
Yeah.
him.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I know him very well. Basically his biographer. And I know how upset, if he does read the book, the book will make him, and how angry it will make him.
Yeah.
But I felt, on an abstract, basic level that, if you write a book about someone,
You
even
let
if
them
they're not
know.
going to like it, they ought to know when
Yeah.
it comes out and what the
Yep.
title is and how they can, and a copy if they want. But I have yet to hear back from him.
I understand. What's next for you, Philip?
So, well, first, a little bit of relaxing because this was a kind of a marathon.
Yep.
I was on the road. So the book takes place mainly in Ohio. I live in Rhode Island, and I've been on the road for a bit. I'm back home now. I was in Columbus and Cincinnati and Toledo and Cleveland, and I hope to go back to the actual town where this took place in Portsmouth later in the fall. So I'm just kind of decompressing from being on the road, but I have a couple book ideas. At one point in the course of this book, I had to use the Freedom of Information Act, which turned into a lawsuit. And I got really interested in that law, and I would love to write more about that,
Okay.
which is more interesting than it sounds, I think. And I hope to prove that to people. And also, in the course of my years as a journalist, I've gotten really interested in mental health and writing about my own mental health. And I'd love to write a book about that too, because while not the same subject as addiction, they're kind of neighbors, and there's a
Yeah.
lot of stigma involved. And I think there's a lot of power in people standing up and telling their own story and helping to kind of dispel some of the misunderstandings about it. So I'd love to write more books.
Understood. And well done on this one. Tell us
Thank
the
you.
title again.
The book is called Prescription for Pain: How a Once
Okay.
Promising Doctor Became the Pill Mill Killer.
Okay.
And it's a story of the opiate epidemic. It's a story about what's been going on in this country. And it's a story about one of the many, many doctors you mentioned in Florida and
Yep.
Ohio and
Yep.
across the country who have faced criminal charges for prescription drug dealing.
Yep. And the author, for those of you listening, Philip Eil, E-I-L. Thank you so much, Philip, for taking the time to talk to us today. And thank you for jumping into what was not a pleasant area, but reporting on it nevertheless.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening today. You can get Philip's book on Amazon, and his name is Philip, P-H-I-L-I-P, and his last name is Eil, E-I-L. Thank you for listening. We'll come back again with another interview next week. Take care.
You have been listening to the Addiction Podcast, Point of No Return. For more information, reach out to us on Facebook or go to www.theaddictionpodcast.com. Our email is theaddictionpodcast@yahoo.com.